broadcasting for the National Women's Hockey League and hosts the Founding Four podcast. She's a Master of Public Administration from NYU and was a varsity softball player. When she's not at the rink, she's busy advocating for children's rights, so, you know, no small feat. Erin Lakoff is a recent graduate from Concordia's communication program. Last year, he launched the Changing on the Fly podcast, which is a podcast dedicated to the intersection of hockey and social justice. He's also the host of The Rebel Beat, a monthly podcast on revolutionary music. I have no idea what revolutionary music really means, but we can talk about that at lunch. So I'll give you guys the opportunity to introduce yourself a little bit more and talk about what you're doing these days and yeah, how you love hockey, what brings you here.
Okay, well, I think you did a pretty good job of introducing me, so I won't waste too much time on that. I am very excited, though, to talk about covert, overt racism and systemic racism. So between my passion for sport and women in sport, people of color in sport, as well as professionally being an advocate, I'm hoping that I can kind of blend those worlds and share how professionally I try to, in my writing, when I speak to players, how I try to engage in those kinds of conversations and why I feel that because of all of those things and also how I identify that I might have a unique perspective on that.
Hi everyone, so my name is Erin Lakoff, and just to briefly introduce myself and kind of let you know a little bit how I came to doing the work that I'm doing right now around hockey. So I come from Montreal. I come from, I guess, a Jewish family in Montreal that, like a lot of English-speaking families in Montreal in the 1980s, got scared of the whole prospect of Quebec separating, and so my parents fled down the 401 at some point, so we ended up in Toronto. And even though, especially my mom was like a die-hard Habs fan, and remains until this day, even though she's in hostile territory, being in Toronto. And I imagine there's probably a lot of Leafs fans or Toronto Furies fans here, maybe. Yeah, I'm probably in hostile territory myself too. But anyways, that's all right, because this is such an important forum and important topic of conversation beyond our team affinities. And so I grew up in Toronto, grew up playing a lot of hockey. Was never really good at it, but that's fine, that's cool, right? Because it's like, that's not about being good, right? It's just about having fun and enjoying yourself and being part of a team. And then I left hockey when I was a teenager because I just started to get really disgusted with the culture of it. And so, you know, people have been addressing this morning. I loved this morning's panel. I thought it was amazing. I was learning so much, and I'm sure we'll continue to learn throughout the day. But yeah, like for me, it was more the fact that as you get older, things start to get a little bit more competitive, and then, you know, not being a very good player, it's like if you miss a pass or if you like miss an important scoring opportunity, you'd hear about it in the dressing room from your team afterwards. And so I would get called all sorts of names, like a fag or a wimp and stuff like that, you know, and that stuff stings, especially coming from, you know, we were talking about the insults and the chirping that get hurled on you from the opposing team. But when that's coming from your own teammates in your own dressing room, that hurts. So as a teenager, I left hockey at a certain point. You know, obviously, also if you're not that good, you can only go so far. I'm gonna stop harping on how bad of a hockey player I am. But you know, it's like I still hold this incredible love for the game, and then I moved back to Montreal and got really, really involved in social justice activism. So throughout like the last decade and a half, I've been really involved in refugee support work and working with undocumented refugees and immigrants. You know, especially in the last few years, doing more anti-fascist work, seeing this really disturbing rise of the far right across lots of parts of North America. And I kind of felt, I guess, for a while, like there was the hockey side of my life and then the activist side of my life, and these two were like completely separate from each other. And, you know, I felt like being in the hockey world, you can't really bring up the kinds of issues that we're bringing up today. And you know, vice versa, in the activist world, people look at sports and like, ew, like that's macho, that's awful, that's just whatever. And of course, as we all know, like, yes, that macho, that racist sexist side to sports can exist, but it's not intrinsic to sports. It doesn't have to exist, and that's why, again, these forums are really important. And then, and then in more recent years, just seeing the amazing work of athletes like Colin Kaepernick, Serena Williams, of athletes who have so much to say, who speak out and take action, right? Like Colin Kaepernick's gestures for me were the most powerful thing someone could do, right? Because he, I have problems with the Nike slogan, but like he did sacrifice everything, right? And to make a stance against police brutality and racial discrimination. And so I started doing this podcast, Changing on the Fly, which I hope people check out, as a way to kind of look at how do we start to bridge these worlds, right? Like if we're people who want to see a better world, a world filled with like more justice and more dignity for human beings, how can we start to work towards those goals, but through the lens of sports, which I find really fascinating because we are seeing these conversations around us today. Maybe not as much in hockey as I would like to, or as some of us would like to, but I really hope that the podcast that I'm doing can kind of serve as like a jumping point, a jumping off point rather, to have those conversations.
All right, so let's start you off with the kind of the big question, maybe a two-parter. What are some of the biggest issues facing hockey media with respect to racism and anti-racist practices? And on the flip side of that, where are some of the biggest changes that you have seen over the past few years?
I think the biggest issue is that we have no idea how to deal with racism, difference of culture. I mean, that comes from the broadcasting booth, where everything from post-game celebration can be deemed, like outside of hockey. And that's interesting for me because I'm completely new to hockey as of 4 years ago with the start of the National Women's Hockey League. Other than that, I, was like a Charlie Conway fan. That's a Mighty Ducks reference, by the way. But, that was it. That was my favorite hockey player. Yeah, Charlie, yeah, from Dawson's Creek, that guy. That's the biggest issue. And for someone coming into the sport new, for someone who identifies as Afro-Latina, for someone who knows what it feels like as a woman to be in spaces where I am not very overt and covertly accepted, expected, or welcomed. It's been interesting to see that play out in hockey. But part of it comes from, and a lot of the panelists earlier did a great job of talking about that, but we're not talking about race. And when there are opportunities, when race smacks hockey in the face, the hockey community doesn't do a good enough job of stepping back, of listening, of bringing people into the conversation. Instead, it almost seems as the PR tactic from a media perspective is just to not talk about it, as if that will, just let it go and no one will say anything, because that's the polite, like, hockey thing to do, right? So that's kind of what I see as the biggest issue. I think an offshoot of that is, because of all of those things, that there are also people who might want to have conversations about race, who might want to share the experiences that they had with racism in the sport, with sexism, homophobia, or any other ism. There are not spaces where they are encouraged to do that. And that also comes from the hockey culture. Why do those spaces, why are they not welcoming? Perhaps that's because there are not a lot of people that look like me who cover hockey, who are given a platform to cover a sport in a way that the people playing that sport, who are managers, who are athletic trainers, feel comfortable sharing their experience without being the other, right? Without feeling that they're outside of the hockey community. So I think it comes from the culture, and not as a hockey community not wanting to have certain conversations, but then because of that we perpetuate otherness, we perpetuate a space where you just have to soldier on, you put your pads on, and you go out there and you play hockey, you play for your team, you play for your country, you play for the love of the sport. Anybody who's an athlete knows what that means, right? You soldier on, you suck it up, bootstraps, all those different, ways that we kind of talk about pushing through something. But that doesn't make the experiences that are uncomfortable in the hockey community, it doesn't make them go away. And so as far as ways to overcome that, I think we need to be a community where we are more willing to listen to each other. And some of that comes from the locker room. There were conversations about what happens in the locker room. I think that comes from, and we're speaking as media essentially, that comes from us being better at allowing hockey players to share their experiences. Do better in the defensive zone, more pucks on net. I mean, everyone knows, right, that you're going to see that in every write-up. And of course, you don't want to give away trade secrets, but there are also opportunities for us to get to know hockey players, to get to know hockey executives. And maybe it's not, tell me all the times that you've been called, and I'm going to use the word nigger. Tell me every time that you have heard that word used to describe you on the ice. I'm not asking that we do that, but what if you asked a player, tell me the origin of your name. How did you get your name? I have a story about how I got my first name. I have a story about my last name, my father's name, who's no longer here with me. Maybe that's a way that you get people to open up.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head earlier when you said too that these stories kind of smack us in the face and then we don't really know how to respond. I want to come back to the Jonathan Diaby incident that was brought up earlier, because I think this is a crucial moment that all of us need to understand. It points to not only the racism in the game, but also the deep racism I'm so ashamed of as a Quebecer. And you brought it up before. What's happening in Quebec right now is it's scary. It's really scary. And we're doing our best to bring thousands of people out into the streets to demonstrate against this horrible racist law that the provincial government in Quebec is trying to bring through. So I want to come back to that, but I listen to a lot of hockey podcasts because I love them. You didn't plug your podcast.
I didn't.
Plug your podcast.
Okay, I am a co-host of the Founding Four podcast. It is focused on the National Women's Hockey League, the NWHL, and so that's my podcast.
So that one's in my feed, but there's a lot of great ones out there, especially a lot of way more podcasts that are hosted by women and people of color too, which I think is amazing. There's Joshvina Shah's podcast, Stick to Sports, anyways, so many more. I think some of them are listed on the back of the program. But I'm a frequent listener of the Hockey Night in Canada podcast, which CBC puts out. So Rob Pizzo, really interesting broadcaster. But maybe to do a little bit of criticism to kind of talk about what I think is problematic in terms of how the hockey media approaches incidents of racism is, so are people here familiar with the Jonathan Diaby incident that happened in the North American Hockey League last month? It was brought up before. So anyways, maybe just to recap, Jonathan Diaby is a black Quebecois hockey player, plays with the Marquis de Jonquière in the North American Hockey League, of course, so it's a major junior hockey league, and was just
I think that's semi-pro. That's not individual.
Sorry, okay, yes, thank you. Always good to fact check, which is important in media. And so he was having racist insults hurled at him on the ice. He took a penalty at one point, and a fan got up. There's video of this incident happening. A fan gets up and starts showing him photos of a baboon on his phone and is mocking him. And then his family, who are in the stands, also start to kind of feel this racist wrath of the fans, and the reaction was so disgusting, is that rather than getting all the racist fans to leave the arena, the family has to leave, and then Jonathan Diaby has to leave in tears. And he wrote a really powerful piece about it, which you can find. It's on CBC, and the title of it, I've got it printed out right here. It's so telling. So this game was in Saint-Jérôme, Quebec, which is about an hour north of Montreal. The title of his write-up of this incident, in his own words, he says, it's 1920 in Saint-Jérôme, Quebec. So just think about that, right? what he's feeling today in 2019, it feels like 1920 and the Jim Crow Deep South. And what he says is, this is again his own words. Yes, we are lucky to live in a society like ours, which is more open-minded than most societies in the world, but let's not lie to ourselves. Racism is everywhere all the time. Everywhere all the time, right? And so the Hockey Night in Canada podcast had Diaby on to talk about the incident in his own words, but what I found was a little bit problematic with how the hosts of the Hockey Night in Canada podcast were talking about is they were using this language of racism creeping into the arena, right? So there was kind of like this questioning of how does this racism creep into our hockey arenas? And if we come back to Jonathan Diaby's words, right, racism is everywhere all the time. So why try to kid ourselves to think we think about sports as this meritocratic institution where no matter what color you are, if you can play the game, you can play the game, right? That's the You Can Play Project slogan. If you can play, you can play. But the hockey arena is a public institution. It is part of society. It is not separate from society. And we have to be honest with ourselves, we live in a white supremacist society. Here we are right now in Kingston, Ontario, the birthplace of Johnny MacDonald, right, whose slogan was "A White Canada Forever." He was the architect of residential schools in this country, right? This is the deep-seated racism that is part of the fabric of Canadian society. And so why, as media, would we kind of treat it as okay, there's these forces of racism that we know exist out there that are abhorrent, yet they're kind of seeping into the arena? No, I mean, it doesn't work like that, right? The arena is a place in society. And so I think that if we acknowledge that, it allows us to lean in to these issues in a bit of a stronger way. And it also allows us, right, when we see these critiques again of players like, Colin Kaepernick and Eric Reed, right, who are saying, this doesn't belong on the field. Well, no, it absolutely belongs on the field because, again, the field is a place in society, right? The rink is a place in society. And so for especially of players of color, when they come into the rink or when they come onto the field, you're not leaving your skin at the door, right? You come in with your identity as the whole human being that you are. And so I think as media, we have to kind of be a little bit critical of that notion of the creep,
Well said.
Nicely said. So we are saying practical learning as best that we can do. So let's start off with a couple of do's and don'ts from your perspective for media. What are things that they should be doing and what are things that they should be avoiding in a very literal sense in their day-to-day work?
Well, I think it was telling that as I was traveling here from the United States, from New York, that the AP guidelines changed. And so there were two things that really stood out to me. One was no hyphens. The AP is going to go to a term where African hyphen American isn't a thing. I think that's really interesting in a lot of different ways. I'm very almost obsessed with this idea and how we as societies perpetuate otherness. And I think that, and what I mean by that is to go back to being on a foundation of white supremacy and imperialism, for that matter. And that the goal in society is still, through our systems, to be as close to white and how whiteness is identified in your society as possible. And so I could go on forever on that, but if you have questions, please ask, please ask, please ask. So anyway,
What's AP?
AP is, yes, it's a style guide. It's a writing guide on how to, everything from the use of the Oxford comma to how you use parentheses, all kinds of things. So it's a writing style guide, yes, thank you. Another thing that they have in there, and I think this goes to kind of the creeping in of racism, is to, and I'll read this, this was some slides that I saw on Twitter, when it comes to race-related incidents, right? Do not use racially charged, racially motivated, racially triggered or similar terms or euphemisms when for racist or racism when those terms are truly applicable. So you hear that a lot. It's like an incident was, yes, we come and we live in our skin, we live with our lived experiences, but what are the things that we all navigate through? So as writers, one of them is a style guide. So I liked that that was coming from AP. I think it also goes back to the conversation on the other panel as far as what can happen and what are the criteria for coaches. What is criteria for journalists who are covering? What's the criteria for, I am in the social field. I got a master's degree at New York University, and the only class that I had on race was an elective in which and I had a huge issue with my professor on this, but in a course that met once a week for half a semester, one of our goals for the class was to eradicate white supremacy. And I was like, right, so okay, you feel me. Okay, love that idea, but I'm gonna see you once a week. Like, is this a SMART goal, as we like to say? I'm not sure. But in that class then, which the premise was to eradicate white supremacy, we were told, this was right around the time that Michael Brown was shot dead, left in the street for hours. We were told, okay, we know this happened, we're going to spend 5 minutes on it and then go back to the syllabus. Just going to let that sit there. Right, so when we're talking about how to talk about race, how we present it, and doing things like what AP did, great, I think that's great, but then also we have to hold ourselves accountable to those, right? You can't say that you want to end and eradicate white supremacy and then spend 5 minutes on a racially motivated, right? Racially motivated, because that's how we talk about Michael Brown in the United States in particular, a racially motivated incident. No, get rid of the fact that it's racially motivated, that talk about race and racism, so that's a step that AP is doing, but then also be able to acknowledge that this takes time. So another thing that I want to leave you with and how to create space for that time is another organization based out of the United States. It's called Race Forward. They also have their journalistic arm is Color Lines. So at Race Forward is their handle, and then at Color Lines. And what I liked about a training that I went through with them is that first of all they do give a definition of racial equity. So I want to share that because I think it's important, or racial justice. Racial justice is the systemic fair treatment of people of all races that results in equitable opportunities and outcomes for everyone. And what does that mean for hockey? Well, the way that when we went through this training, I was doing it as a professional development training, is that we were asked to, every day, I want you to think about this, let's go through this activity together. Every day, what are you responsible for when it comes to hockey? So if you're a player, you are responsible for getting your equipment together. You're responsible for, you daily, weekly, monthly, just think about that. As a coach, as a member of the media, what are the things that we do every day in the hockey field, every week in the hockey field, every month and annually? And write that list down. And then flip that sheet over and ask yourself the same question, but with how can I create a more equitable experience every day in hockey, every week in hockey, monthly in hockey, annually in hockey? That was a practical tool that Race Forward and through their training that they gave us that I think is easy for us to incorporate into something like a coach's training, into a locker room, into a journalism school that we can do. And those are things that it's not, asking people to decide which side they're on when it comes to Colin Kaepernick, which side they're on when it comes to other things. It's like, let's together figure out how we can every day be conscious of our opportunities, the places where we can bring in equity and racial justice in everything that we do. So you make different decisions, is the hope. If I want to be focused on racial justice, then every day, if I'm answering emails, how many emails am I answering if I'm a youth, how many emails do I answer from a youth serving organization? That's one of the things that I ask myself. If I want to be a child advocate and I'm not answering emails from youth serving organizations, and I'm only answering emails from politicians, then I'm not really a child advocate, as an example.
In terms of do's and don'ts, I think one really important do is, well, first of all, I mean, if we're looking at things from, let's say, like an Indigenous solidarity and decolonizing perspective, I think that it's really important for those of us who are not Indigenous to come back and look at the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I really appreciated that the specific calls to action vis-a-vis sports are also printed in the program here. And that's an incredibly powerful tool, right? Like, for me, what it says as a settler here in Canada is it says, here's a roadmap that has been laid out. I mean, I know it's not a perfect roadmap, and Indigenous people have critiqued the process, and I think those critiques are valid, but it is one tool amongst many that we have in order to start to move forward in terms of like respectful nation-to-nation relationships, right? And so for those of us, I imagine most of us here in this room work in sports in one way or another. This is like a gift to us. This says, okay, here are 5 tangible steps you can take as hockey media, as athletes, as people who work in the field to work towards decolonization. One of those calls to action, which I really take to heart, is to tell the histories of Indigenous athletes, right? And so I loved hearing the history of George Armstrong before. That's well, as someone who's not a Leafs fan, I wasn't really familiar with that history, but I'm going to look it up. I had the incredible honor of sitting down and interviewing Fred Sasakamoose last year, who got the Order of Canada, played 1 season with the Chicago Blackhawks. Won't say he was the first Indigenous player, but was regarded as one of the first in the NHL, and of course a residential school survivor. He has an amazing story. I got to interview Chief Wilton Littlechild, who has done a lot of work around sport and reconciliation, and so I'm going to be putting that interview out on my podcast soon. So again, you can subscribe to Changing on the Fly, and you'll hear that.
Much better at that.
But then one thing, and I want to come back again to the Diaby incident. I don't want to harp a lot on it, but again, I think this is like a moment where if hockey doesn't change after what happened, after what went down in Saint-Jérôme a month ago, I mean, that's going to be heartbreaking. But if we come back to the Diaby incident and how the media covered it afterwards, there was a lot of like hand-wringing from not only the league itself, but also from politicians, right? Like the story went viral, and so of course, as things do when they go viral, they work their way up the chain all the way to, well, I don't know if like Justin Trudeau stepped in, but the provincial government definitely had to step in at some point and say something about it. And so, François Legault, who's the current premier of Quebec, went from the media and just said, oh, this is a horrible incident. Again, this has no place in the hockey world. How could something like this creep into the arena? Meanwhile, Legault has just tabled, of course, we talked about this law on secularism. It was just tabled 2 days ago. He wants to make it essentially illegal for Jewish men like myself, well, I don't wear the kippah, but Jewish men who wear the kippah, for Sikh men who wear a turban, for Muslim women who wear a hijab, they won't be able to work in the public service. And I mean, it's scary, right? Like they're trying to make reassurances, like they're going to put in a grandfather clause so that, teachers who wear hijabs won't lose their jobs. But what is this saying to, tens if not hundreds of thousands of people of color in Quebec right now? That because of, the choice you make, you're a lesser human being. You're not, good luck ever following your dream, becoming a police officer or a teacher or a principal, because no, we're passing a law against it. And that, I mean, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to see what's happening right now. They're saying they're going to invoke the notwithstanding clause so that it could prevent a constitutional challenge against this law. And the fact that Legault was not questioned about that by the hockey media, I thought, how can we have it that a premier is saying this type of racism has no place in the arena, yet right now his government is passing an obviously racist piece of legislation, right? And of course, like yes, of course we have to make distinctions between the dynamics around anti-black racism that Diaby was subject to and Islamophobia. They come from two very different histories, but they are one and the same thing in terms of white supremacy. And so I think, just to end this thought, I think the hockey media has to do a much better job in terms of contextualizing these issues, right? In terms of, like, we as the media, like, we're supposed to be the fifth estate. We're supposed to hold politicians accountable and hold people in power accountable, right? The same goes for athletes or, you know, for commissioners in the NHL or people who hold power in society. We as the media need to question that power. And so the fact that the Go wasn't questioning on that, right? Okay, you're denouncing this racism, yet look at what your government is about to do. I think we missed an opportunity there.
So before I hand it over to the audience, one opportunity I wanted to give you is to amplify or highlight some white allies in the media world, hockey media world, that you think are doing a good job. Aaron, in your podcast, you state before you start each episode that the intent is to amplify voices from the margins and bring them to center ice, which I think you do a great job of, bringing Indigenous voices and women and people of color. So are there other people out there that you would like to give a shout out to?
So there are a lot of thoughts that I have right now swimming through my head. One is that, yes, of course. But another is that I sometimes have difficulty not with the act of allyship, but in how we talk about allies. So I'm a little bit hesitant to engage in that conversation. And it's not like a fully formed idea, so work with me here. But just sometimes I think we can take not necessarily people, but conversations off the hook by saying, oh, this is a good white ally. And sometimes then we also take people of color out of the conversation by always being asked to highlight allies. Because by using the term, sometimes we're implying that they don't empathize or understand completely, because they don't have to, I should say. They don't have to by nature of how they're identified. So I just want to put that out there. But yes, of course. So I see a sticker over here, Sticks, Taps, and Snark from the Victory Press. That's a media outlet that I've written for, and I think that does a good job having these conversations. I also think that allies don't always necessarily have to not speak about race and racism. They don't always necessarily have to speak about race or racism. So I think of someone who I would consider a confidant and ally is Mike Murphy at Dig Deep BSB. Shout out to my co-host, well, no longer my co-host on the Founding Four pod. He's moving on, but I'll get him back. Anyway, but Mike, the reason I think that he's an important sounding board for me is because he doesn't always try to sit in my seat, to walk in my shoes, but allows me very organically to be who I am. And I think that's where I was going back to media. We need to allow athletes to be who they are and bring all of themselves, and also respect that they might not always want to be on as the gay athlete, as the black athlete, as the woman, in any of those situations. So I don't know if that answers the question, but those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, you're right. Like, I think that the notion of allyship, there's some problems with it. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily good for us as white folks to be, like, walking around saying, I'm an ally, right? Like, I mean, you're an ally if a person of color says, hey, you're a good ally, but I mean, I'm not necessarily gonna, like, put the sticker on my forehead. But, I mean, I've learned a lot from Dave Zirin, who is an incredible sports writer, a sports historian, and just an exciting podcaster and political writer. So if people haven't checked out Dave's books, he's got, I think, like a dozen or so of them, and an amazing podcast, Edge of Sports. Yeah, but beyond that, I mean, I just think, like, myself, in terms of, like, the work that I'm trying to do is, as a journalist, I really try to follow the principle of going to where the silences are, and then it's where the silences are that you'll find the most noise, right? Like, because, and what I mean by that is, people who have been intentionally swept aside from the media oftentimes have a lot to say. Like, they've got incredible stories to share. This history of the Colored Hockey League, Bob, that you brought up before, I think is such a fascinating story. It tells us so much about Canadian history, and so much that, people who want to be allies in the room, like, we need to know that history because it tells us a lot about segregation in Canada. We're not necessarily taught a lot about segregation in Canada growing up, but we had similar kinds of Jim Crow type laws in this country that they had in the Deep South, and the Colored Hockey League is an incredible example of something beautiful that bloomed out of a really ugly segregation. And so, yeah, going to those spaces where we see the silences and trying to make room for more voices. And it's not like, I know that people are doing that, right? Like, there's like, the Black Girls Hockey Club that is like, taking up space in social media to, be visible as like Black women in hockey, that I think is so important. Or we could go on and on.
Yeah, and I do want to say, again, the question was about allyship, and I think I had to just kind of get those thoughts out. But I really appreciate your podcast. So before we met officially at Burn It All Down, their live show, which is another show you should check out, Burn It All Down, always. Anyway, I really appreciate your podcast because as someone who's new to hockey and is from the United States, I think learning the history of hockey through your podcast has been great. But you also mentioned some of the history that has come from, I believe the book is Black Ice, as well as Soul on Ice, which of course Jaden was featured in. So that comes from Soul on Ice coming from Kwame Mason. Also, the Color of Hockey blog has been a space that has been great to learn the history of people and players, officials of color. I always get on William Douglas. Let's get some more ladies in there. But he's now with the NHL.com, so good for Bill on that. And so those are just a few other things I wanted to shout out.
Any questions from the floor?
Hi, so this is kind of like I think like everyone enjoying that's having this conversation at all. So this question is kind of like a smearing of like lots of different things that people have spoken to so far today. And it also kind of is to everyone in the room. I mean, you guys are sitting there, but everyone else is sitting here too. I wanted to ask about a number of different things, and I'm just going to start by, I don't know if referencing this talk, given that has nothing to do with hockey. What's her name? Hannah Gadsby. She has a small talk where she talks about the good men, and she's talking about feminism, but she's talking about how the good men get to set the line that people are or are not allowed to cross. And that came to mind, and then people started talking about gender, people kept talking about racism in hockey, and so then you started talking about the creep. And I started to think about racism in hockey versus just hockey as racist. Like the hockey that we know right now, unfortunately, the game we inherited is a game that I think a lot of people love, but the version of it we have right now is a racist version. And so it's, I think, just reorienting our language that it's not that racism's in it, like you're kind of pointing to, it's that the game we've got right now is predicated on that. So if that's the case, then we need to reckon, that's what we're reckoning with. And also, like what Rob was saying earlier, that's what when we're looking for our how as opposed to the what, the how is like, how do we reckon with the fact that hockey, as we know it, is racist? And if that's what we're looking for, then I think we need to take very seriously the expertise of hockey players who have experienced racism on and off the ice. And so that's part of why this day is so important. And yet, and I say this as somebody who's not a hockey player, but as somebody who's just very close to the game and close to people who play it. So we need to take people's experiences seriously, but I hear people saying And even today, people have said, either themselves or their family members have said like, oh, it's okay because it's just my buddy saying that kind of stuff. And so it got me thinking about like the good men or the good players or the good whatever. But who is setting that line? So I guess when I'm thinking about the how, it's like what we need is a how, like how is, and that's a huge question, and yeah, but I don't know where else to ask it other than a day like today, so I thought I would just throw it in
Yeah,
there.
thank you for all of that. I'm sorry, what was your name?
Angela.
Angela? Thank you, Angela. I think that you hit on a lot of things. I think you kind of encompassed that otherness that I try to talk about, and I love that you mentioned that hockey as we inherited it is racist because of all of the history of our culture. I think that's extremely important, and that's a really nice tilt that you gave. Some other things that swirled through my head while you were speaking were, again, the opportunities and some conversations that I've had with people during the break. It goes back to something that Brother Dawson said about, it's not about, I wrote it down, but something about whether it's changing the people to change the culture or changing the culture that will eventually change the people. And I think that also goes to how we talk about race and racism and how we start to shift hockey. And I think that relates in some way to what you are saying. But I think Billie Jean King once told me, I totally just plugged that. I talked to her because it was amazing. Anyway, when I was asking her about Title IX and why she felt it was so important and what work has been done since, the reason that Title IX was important is because it became law. And her take on engaging more women, Title IX, of course, being for women in the United States, when she felt that there's not much that you can do when it comes to calling out sexism or racism if there isn't law to support it. Because that is how we are governed. As a political science major, there are lots of things that I can say about that, but we'll just stick with that sweeping premise for now, although I believe it to be false. But anyway, generally speaking, we go by the rule of law. But who sets the rule of law? If when we set the rule of law, right, the rules that govern a sport, a community, if those are inherently racist, right, then those people and the people that benefit from a racist set of laws continue to be in power, then we're going to have a challenge. So that's why Billie Jean King, again, went back to Title IX being in and rooted in law in the United States being so important. And so I think that does go back to the governance of USA Hockey, of Hockey Canada, of the NHL, of the league that I work with, the National Women's Hockey League. You have to make some changes there. And I think that the NHL, whether it's through Kim Davis or I'm going to get the name of the committee wrong, but there's a committee that's working, that there are females working alongside the game. But this
we're calling it the Women's Advisory Panel.
There it is,
Yeah.
the Women's Advisory Panel. I think that some of that has to happen. What I don't think that, how do I want to say this? Words are hard, even as a writer. That is a good start, but it's not the only thing. What also has to happen is more of that cultural change. What the coaches were talking about earlier, or the players, about creating a community where you can have that communication. That has to happen as well, because you can have a law, but if people are, you go back to science, right? If a dog is used to being whipped when they go and go to grab something, they're not going to go back to that dish, right? They're not going to do it. It's that we're the same. If you're used to, when you bring up certain issues, not having it, you're not being heard, there's no change being made, then the law changing itself is not going to change the behavior. So both have to happen at the same time. And so as you were kind of laying out what your questions, comments, those are some of the things that I was thinking of and that I think are important, is to remember that we can and should change how we govern things, but that we can't expect, just because things aren't changing immediately after governance, that means, one, that the law is inherently bad, or that it's inherently good for that matter. It just means that there is still work that we need to do as humans with other human beings to make sure that we're all uplifting each other to make sure that we are utilizing those outlets.
And yeah, I'll just add a couple quick things on maybe like some of the hows in terms of like what we can do to improve. And I'll mention a couple examples that I think are really uplifting examples that are happening in hockey media right now. The Cree broadcast that just happened, right? I mean, I'm sure a lot of people heard about this, but like that was incredible. I mean, I don't have a TV, so I don't have APTN, and then the day of the game, oh my God, as a Habs fan, that was awful to watch. But I was making a joke. I was like, I really want to learn how to say in Cree, the Habs just blew their shot at the playoffs. They essentially did at that game. But, you know, like just to see, like on social media, like following people, like posting these like photos of like their grandmothers, like watching that game in tears and like never having experienced that before, I think was so powerful. And so, you know, great, like this year we had like one game in Cree. Next year, let's have a dozen, and then like let's have games broadcast in like Kaniagahaga and like Mi'kma'ki and like all of these indigenous languages that we know are on the verge of extinction and that people are working so hard to try to revive. And we know that hockey culture is so huge in these communities. Like, let's make room for that. So I'm glad that happened. I'm glad it was like promoted at all the top levels. And then the other thing, because I mean, I think we have to talk intersectionally, of course. So this is racism in hockey, but it could just as well be feminism in hockey. I mean, there has to be way more women's pro games broadcast. I think that's like obvious at this point, and who knows? I mean, maybe this like one league that we keep talking about, maybe it'll happen next year. Who knows? I hope it happens soon. But like, you know, it's like I just tuned into the Clarkson Cup last weekend. Again, don't really want to talk about that because of how Montreal fared. But like, you know, that's amazing that Sportsnet broadcasts the Clarkson Cup, but there have to be more CWHL games broadcast, more NWHL games broadcast, because people talk about audiences, right? Like, oh, is the audience going to be there for women's hockey? Well, in Montreal, like we had 10,000 people, or almost 10,000 people, come out to a Canadiens game at the Bell Centre when they played there. Like, we know that there is a huge interest, and so I think it's a bit like people are having this whole like chicken or the egg conversation. Like, are the audiences there? Well, we know that the fan base is there, so like let's make room for more of this to happen.